Hello everybody and welcome back, where today we're tackling something that I should have probably covered in PSVR2 news yesterday, but I wanted to kind of talk about a bit more in depth and in that kind of glossed over and fast format. And that is that a brand new VR studio has opened in Japan with some very lofty goals that I personally am quite excited about, but also have a couple of reservations. Before we get into it, only 25% of you are subscribed to the channel, so please feel free to do so. And thank you to our patrons and members who are all on screen right now, and I could not do this without each and every one of them. With that being said, let's take a look at the brand new studio that just opened by the producer of BLOODBORNE. Sirius Studio is the name of the game here. Sirius is an offshoot of a couple of developers and producers who worked for Thirdverse. Now, Thirdverse will get into their games a little bit later and why they chose to leave Thirdverse, but essentially they've started Sirius Studio to focus on high-end games, both in the flat screen, VR, and XR space. They spoke to Famitsu a little while ago, where a bit more context is given about these guys. The three developers who left Thirdverse have a pedigree of Bloodborne, Demon's Souls, Soul Sacrifice, Astrobot Rescue Mission, which is a very, very good sign, and a lot of other games. And after leaving Sony, after working on Astrobot and Bloodborne, went over to Thirdverse, developed Soul Covenant, and oversaw the studio, not necessarily developing anything, but producing. This spring, these three became independent and started Sirius, developing large-scale titles for home game consoles and VR and XR games in the future. We have Hideki Irai, I don't want to get that wrong, Akiyuki Toriyama, who is the big name people are talking about, producer of Bloodborne, Demon's Souls, etc., and of course Astrobot for the PSVR1. And throughout the interview they talk a lot about the game industry in general and what they want to do, but the bit I want to focus on is them speaking about VR and XR. They say, "We at Sirius Studio are characterized by attacking in high-end directions such as VR and XR titles and home game console titles. They want to focus on high-end titles, or mid-sized games, as they say. They don't want to be characterized as an indie developer, and they're optimistic about the VR game industry, citing sources that 30% of teenagers living in the US currently own VR headsets, so they want to develop content for those markets." That's a big thing that these three are leaning into, especially throughout the entirety of this interview, is that they want to become an overseas phenomenon with their games. When I think of Thirdverse, and especially in the VR space and on PSVR2, I think of Soul Covenant, and that game had a lot of JRPG elements, a lot of exposition and a lot of fast combat, and quite a convoluted story in places that threw a lot at you at once. And I think for a Western audience, a lot of us aren't really used to that sort of thing, especially in the style and format it's presented in. It's just not how Western games are made, and ultimately I don't think it's a very good fit for VR. For Soul Covenant, I felt myself kind of sat there listening through audio logs and reading through different menus in the games and not really doing much for long periods of time before getting into the action, which admittedly was pretty fun. That's not quite what I want out of a VR game, and hopefully they're shifting in the direction of being more VR AF, for lack of a better term, and a little bit more accessible to an audience overseas here. That being said, Eastern game devs have some fantastic ideas, and I hope they don't completely abandon those, because they do make for incredible games. Overall, though, the main thing about this interview in particular is that they are optimistic about VR. But what else have they actually said about PSVR2? Because they're very broad when talking about VR and XR here, and I'm sure they will be developing some stuff for Quest, maybe Steam, but they do talk about home consoles and virtual reality, and they have spoken about PSVR in the past. Throughout the various interviews they've had as well, the representative director of Sirius Studio talks about the original PSVR1 back in 2016 and saying how he believed that that was the future of entertainment, and how the studio definitely wants to build AA and AAA experiences for VR, citing that as the main inspiration almost 10 years ago now, which somehow makes me feel old. But what can we actually realistically expect out of this team? Now, if they're looking at flat and VR, I would say the easiest route for them would be hybrid games that you just have to buy once, can play with a headset and without a headset, and will attract both markets. In terms of size, a game comparable to, say, Metro, Behemoth, or Alien maybe, not too long, but of good quality, I think is a good mark to hit for a studio that wants to aim for mid AA to AAA caliber. A game doesn't have to be incredibly long and bloated, but it just has to feel tight and polished, and I think with their pedigree at Bloodborne, Astrobot Rescue Mission, and in some places Soul Covenant for me, I feel like they could pull that off. What genres they want to delve into and how long it's going to take to make these, we're not sure. It's probably going to be a couple years until we hear anything more about this, but I thought it was quite exciting news and I wanted to cover it today. Let me know what you think of this studio opening. What would be your dream hybrid genre for them to tackle? Less so a game, because I don't think they'll be doing any ports like that, but dream idea for a VR game. For a dev studio like this one, with their pedigree that they do have, what would you like to see? For me, any sort of Souls-like game would be fantastic, I think. As long as I can get the movement right, the parrying, the dodging without making it feel too janky, I think that could be awesome. And I'm interested to see how they tackle a more westernized style of game. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.